I'm Duke Craven from Kingdom of Aidenveld.
Basic range, the whole concept about this is just to discuss the parameters of range, and the whole purpose of having parameters for range. It's like me and some friends sat down. We used to have this practice once a week, and we'd have like about 15, 20 guys show up, and we wanted to focus on training, and basically we created a situation where you have to have like a class outline, a curriculum, and so forth. And so range came up as one of the foundation pieces of fighting, and so we had to decide a lot of different variety of pieces to that. We built this class, and it's been basically the thing we've been continually using, and it also, we wanted to bridge a gap because those everybody that's traveled or intermingled with a different kingdom culture than your own, you find out that the vocabulary of fighting is different. It's just like soda and pop and cola and Coke. We have different words for the same things a lot of times, and then when it comes to fighting, though, there can be some really weird names for side. Like someone using an onside shot for a flat snap seems really weird to me. But it's like, oh, it's just your kingdom vocabulary for the same thing, and it's trying to connect those dots. So when we started doing this range class, the whole idea was to at least get in the kingdom, we had a common terminology for the same thing. So that way, when we're working with students and so forth, we can communicate effectively and not waste time. Because when you have guys for like 2 hours to 3 hours a night, you want to get a lot of information out so you can get to application and study and and learning that piece. So we created this basic range to help do the vocabulary part, and then also to have a reference zero calibration point to work from. So we're on the same page. So what we mean by range. So basically on range, when I'm talking about range in this class, and in different areas, you're going to have a little bit tweaks to this. So understand this is my perspective and the way I look at it. Is the relationship of yourself to your target. Because out of everything, your primary goal is to hit somebody with a stick. That's rule number one of our game. Hit the other guy with a stick before he hits you. All right. And hopefully you do it sufficiently. That's where the supporting rules come along, right? But so it's that relationship from you to your opponent. So the next part came up, was like, well, how do you measure that? Because we got people that are 6'2", like Duke Aaron, and then you got a 5 foot tall person fighting. So this range difference between those two individuals is huge, right? But we got to get them on a commonality. Well, when you think about it, their relationship to their target is the commonality. So if I'm 6'3", how close to my target is the same as it is if I'm 5 foot tall. My relationship to my target is the same, right? So with that in mind, that's the key thing to listen to this class, because we get it a little bit farther when we start evaluating a little bit about the different range. So next thing we did was we tried to determine what are the different ranges and so forth. So you have these different ranges, and since it's my relationship to my target, well, my target really is not just this human being, but it's parts of the body of that human being. So I basically slice up my opponent into 3 pieces. So you got the back, middle, and front of that target, right? And the relationship of this is important to understand too, is if you fight a 40-inch sword and a 36-inch sword, the 4 inches of difference is huge when you fight, when it comes down to things. So having an idea of, hey, these are my targets. Well, if I have a 40-inch sword, I can reach the back a little farther away. I have 4 inches of sword, right? So that's why this diagram actually is important to the process a little bit, is that back, middle, and front. And so we divided the range up into 3 places. We got A, B, and C. I don't know why we did A as the closest and C as the farthest, but we did what we did. So A is close range, B is middle range, C is outside range. Um, I think the letters make it a little easier for a added layer of complexity to new people that they won't understand what you're talking about. So they have to understand they have to learn our code. That was a joke if you don't know me. But it did to make the conversation a lot easier. It's like, hey, when you're at C range, you're initiating to throw the flat snap, which really is a B range shot. You probably should work on determining your range before you throw when you throw that shot and so forth. So that was the whole purpose of that, right? Okay, so how do you measure this range? How do you define these range? And that's kind of important. I look at it as in your sword, in your hand, in the distance away from your guy. C range, we look at as being able to hit the front targets, right? So you're on that line. So the front targets are all the front of the body, right? So you can hit a tip to the face, you can hit, stab to the chest. You can also hit the arm, which is another factor involved here, right? So these are the front targets. They're available at the C range is the way we measure it. So I think it is if my tip of my sword can hit the front of my opponent, I'm in C range. But there was an adder that we ended up adding to this after application in class to people, and it was also taking consideration of taking a small step, not a giant step, just to keep in mind that small step and hitting the front of the targets. And the reasoning for this is when you think about this outside range, you're engaged with your opponent at this point, right? Because he possibly could hit you. You possibly can hit him. Your actions are going to get reactions from that opponent. So that's why that step became a factor involved here, and to keep in mind. So that would be C range. Now B range, if we think about it, we're moving closer into our opponent, so we're being able to get into hitting the middle parts of the target of our opponent. So that's what the circle is. So B range, I'm basically able to hit the side of my opponent, the middle of his body, and the side of his head. So let's say, for example, you're throwing a flat snap to their head. You're at B range when you can do that because you can hit the side of the head. You can't, otherwise you'd be hitting the front of the face and that wouldn't be the side of the head. Just, so just to be the literal aspect of things and for conversation aspect. So that's my B range. And then if I step in a little closer, A range. And a lot of guys, like, our younger fighters or less experienced fighters would run into the issue to where they think that A range is like that range where you're just like face to face, and really, when I think of A range, you're able to throw a wrap to the back of their head. So if you have a 40-inch sword versus a 36-inch sword, that could be an inch difference between the space between your bodies, right? So now that we defined these different ranges, it's to understand the ranges, because the whole thing is range plays a big part in the act of fighting, but really its place that you live with range is at practice, because it's a tool. By defining it this way, you have a tool to start training and working on your fighting, because you have a focus point of where was I when I threw this shot? How far was I away? I'm going to go practice on the Pell, and I'm going to throw some flat snaps. Now, think about this visually. Think about standing in front of your Pell, and you're at the C range, so you can barely hit the front of the target, right? And then you're at B range, and you can hit the middle of the target, and at A range, you can hit the back of the target. Now, throw a flat snap from each one of those ranges. Now, when you throw that flat snap to the side of the head and hit him in the eye, right, you have to throw that shot 3 different ways from each range. It's not the same. But also the other part is your hand is getting closer to the target, right? Because at C range, you're reaching with your hand. When you're at A range, you're pulling your hand back. So what does that mean? You're hitting a different place on your sword. So those are 3 different flat snaps that you could train on your Pell to improve your fighting. Because when we're sitting there talking and coaching each other, because we all have our friends that are helping us, and or you got your knight or the local duke or count or whatever is there, and they're like, yeah, you need to really work on your flat snap. Well, This is 3 layers of 3 different flat snaps. You know, you didn't benefit as a student by not knowing which one it is because you didn't know where you were when you had a problem, right? So I think it beat that horse to death already. So we'll leave that out. But the thing is, so that's the perspective you got to take in with this range a little bit. But okay, so we have this piece involved here, right, with this range. So what we do in this class after this point is after we define what range is and go through the examples and understand what the purpose of this is, we decided that what we're going to move into with it is one of the guys, went to business college, and it was Sir Elias for the local guys, and he's like, hey, why don't we do a SWOT chart, strength, weaknesses, opportunity, threats chart, and basically, it's a way to dissect your problem. You're looking for strengths and you're looking for weaknesses, right? These are the givens. So basically, they're more based in fact. A strength, let's say at B range, you're in range to throw a flat snap, right? So a flat snap's a vulnerable shot. You could say that's a strength, maybe, if throwing a flat snap's a strength. But you have actually more targets available at B. That would be a better example. So if I'm at B range, I can hit the front of my opponent and I can hit the side of my opponent. So with that in mind, I have more targets available to me, right? So where when I'm at C, I have less targets available to me, and I have to reach for the targets. So a weakness at C means I have less targets to hit. If you start doing probabilities, what are the probabilities of me hitting my opponent at C range versus B range are hugely different. Because I have more opportunities to hit my opponent when I'm at B range because there are more targets, right? Opportunities are possibilities of things that can happen to, and positive to you, to where threats are the possibility of something being bad. So, like an opportunity at B range to me would be, at B range, I have an opportunity to change a lateral movement with less effect to my opponent responding. Because we're closer to each other, his reaction time is going to change, right? And so at B range, I have a little more opportunity to, it's an opportunity to move into a position differently than where if we're at C range, where we're barely at hitting the front of the targets, I move left being a lefty, you can see me move and you're like, I'll counter your move by moving to my left, you know what I mean? Or my right or whatever, you move because you can negate the target basically, it's a simple human reaction to that point, right? What are the positive and negatives of each range? Like earlier, I was saying C range, you have less targets than you do B range. That's a weakness, right? What's a strength at C range? We probably all could agree a strength out there is you have more range of movement and you can disengage it pretty easy, right? And your opponent can move out. Now, okay, so the one thing is when you think about your opponent moving out range, that would be a weakness, possibly, but he could be taller. So, remember that earlier part when we're talking about that range in respect to me. So that's a little bit, me to my target. So kind of remember that when you start thinking about it. So we all know that, when you're farther away from a target, it's harder to hit, but you have more opportunity to defend. Vision's better. That's a strength. Your opportunities, you can change your angle to approach onto an opponent from outside C range. So I think everybody's, kind of getting the gist of the idea of this is really you're looking to analyze each range, and, don't overthink it either. If you start overthinking it, it becomes too crazy. Here's one like at C range for food for thought a little bit too. When you're at C range, and since you have less amount of targets to reach and people can see what you throw, what does that mean about your shot? What's the most important thing at that point when you're throwing a shot? So you're swinging farther, you're dependent on inertia to be your form of force to hit the target. And now, your shot has to be accurate and clean. You have no room. Yeah, it's huge. Huge factor right there, right? Now let's go to B range. When you're at B range, your shots have to be as accurate. You're so much closer to your target, more, and you're throwing in zones at that point, right? So, when you get down to it, you're like, oh, well, I just got to hit up at the side of the head, and I got to get around their shield. So B range, what are your strengths? It's like, hey, you have to be less accurate. Well, I guess that would be more of an opportunity, right? Slop counts. Ugly goals still win hockey games. That's the thing to always remember. It's like, what was the prime directive? Hit the other guy with a stick before he hits you. That is the whole thing to remember. It doesn't always have to be pretty. But anyhow, so what are your weaknesses at B range? Your opponent has just gained more targets, possibly, but it's so your defense has to be accurate. Your defense has to be on at that point. There's a tighter opportunity, or tighter window for movement. It's like, yeah, subtle movement is probably an opportunity. You have to move only an inch rather than 4 inches on the outside. Observation is the key thing. That's why the ugly goals comment works. The eye is processing things, and you're much closer. It's just like driving a car at that point. Your relationship to how soon you see the stop sign determines how well you brake and how fast you brake and how hard you brake, right? So B range has those pieces. Now, here's an opportunity at B range that the other two ranges do not give you. And it's, you can engage deeper and you can disengage from B range. So it's a decision point, right? And really this is the one commonality when we discuss B range a little bit with its opportunities and so forth. At B range is probably the one place that you can make a lateral movement more effectively. You can disengage, you can engage deeper, right? So this is like a movement thing. And the way I process it myself is B range is the decision process place. C gets me to B range, and how I approach C to get to the place in B I need will determine if I'm going to go to deeper in A or I'm going to stay at B and go back out to C. And I want to achieve my goal. So this is the place that I make footwork movements and position changes, is at B. And the decision at B, I have to make from input from my opponent. So as soon as I get to B, I'm determining where they're at, what they're doing, where their feet are, where their hand is, where their shoulder is, where their sword is. All those little pieces are going on in my head, evaluating and determining probabilities of things. And I have to make a decision to move. And this is the place that I can decide to move at. And my decision here is important to me, because once I commit to that commitment is not taken back. The only opportunity I have at this point is, do I disengage or do I engage deeper? So B range becomes this thing, right, at that point. Now let's go to A range a little bit. What are the advantages at A range to, when you're in an A range position? Your defense becomes a different sense there also, because let's face it, at that point, you're trying to manage force from a shot from your opponent this place. And really, do you have to sit there and do a huge block? Do you have to block a zone? But you just got to mitigate the force that they're trying to deliver. The one thing with A range is, you have a lot of unprotected targets. Throwing a wrap shot becomes a very good value at A, because it's hard to block a wrap when your shield's attached to the front of your body, and you got to move your sword. You have to disengage for that. Shots are quicker. Yeah, you're shorter, but you're also throwing shorter in on your stick. If you rely on throwing distance with it to hit with the first 3 inches of your sword and you're in close, what does that mean? You have to hit closer to your hilt on your sword. So play, where you have to throw. So, so your shots are quicker if you throw them correctly. But they can be worse because you have to disengage your hand to rotate back so you can get some distance to throw that shot, and that's a key thing to think about, as how you throw your shot at that range. You can use your opponent's shield against them, my foster knight was 5 foot tall and right-handed, and his goal was to go in low, When he got at A range, he would duck. This is a 5 foot tall person ducking. And what happens to the guy that can't see over his shield? He's looking for somebody that's not there. They disappear to his vision. So he's using their shield against him, so you have some opportunities there. This is my recommendation to you is like get with your training buddies, discuss range a little bit. You want to sit there and analyze it. And I think the SWOT works really well. You can Wikipedia it, but you get strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a good way to divide it up, and it's a good way to discuss it. And the one thing you got to think about is, while you're going through this exercise, I would throw it up on a whiteboard, throw up a little plus sign, SWOT, and then the group interacts with me and we talk about it. And if we got to move something to where we're like, you know what, that's actually a strength. It's more of a factual situation rather than an opportunity. Let's move from here. You know what? This is not really a weakness, or this is just, there's no parameters that really make it fit in this category. Let's erase it. But the key thing is when you get done working with this, you start understanding what happens at each range. How does this relate to your training and practice? Because remember, when we were talking about range really is more of a factor when it comes to training. And remember the example I used earlier when your coach is like, hey, you start throwing your flat snap at your C range, and so your opponent really sees it, and you're halfway through the shot when you're at B range, so it's not even a viable target to hit your opponent. We just talked in a language together about this instant that happened while you were fighting, and you're like, oh, so I'm starting my shot at C range? Yeah, you are. And it's like, oh, okay, I really need to be a couple inches closer before I start that shot, because now it becomes a viable threat to my opponent, because that's the message you want to deliver to him. Is, hey, I'm throwing this shot. Hopefully I hit you, or I'm setting up for my next shot, So that's why understanding and applying it to training. So when you start discussing these things and you come up with an idea. So one of the drills we would do in practice, after we discuss what range is and what, the different things in range, you tell me what your range is that you normally fight in. All right, because some people are like, I'm an A range, I'm a B range, and then there's, I'm a C range guy. It's like, C range guys are always obvious. They're always running away backwards, and they're good at running backwards and throwing shots. So usually C range guys know they're a C range fighter for sure. B and A is where people get confused. So we do this, and then we divide up the group. And, depending on how many guys we had, but we basically would do a bear pit, and they would go out and they would fight, right? And then, it's like, all right, so everybody feels solid with what their range is, and they're like, yeah, yay or nay or whatever. We figure that out. And then the next thing is, all right, I'm going to assign a range to you. So we're going to do this bear pit. You get to fight 2 fights in a row if you're the man in the middle, and people go in. And I would go down the line and tell everybody what range they needed to be. And if they said they were a B range fighter earlier, I would tell them to go fight, B range. And then when they were in the man in the middle, I would tell the people that were fighting them, why don't you be A range, why don't you be C range? Because what you're going to find out, B range, nobody's really a solid B range fighter. Because really, if you're a B range fighter, you stay in B range all the time. How hard is it to maintain that middle ground? It is hard to maintain the middle ground, because it's a decision processing piece. And that's the part you'll come back to, I think, in my opinion. What that drill really does in the long run, though, is if you have somebody fight something that's not their normal range, they learn about that range. And they understand that range because they need to understand about that position. So when they apply their tools, I'm fighting a guy that fights predominantly C range mostly. So when he initiates to his target, it's always at C range. What is his triggers? What does he do? So forth, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, well, I know my front targets are the ones he's trying to get. He has to be accurate to hit me. So if I can gray the line of all the targets to him to where they are not obvious to him or obvious that he can hit them cleanly, he knows he can't hit me. So now I'm negating him. I'm making his task harder by creating my hand. I pull my hand back a little bit further. I push my shield out a little bit further. I'm looking for those things because I'm understanding my opponent and I am applying something to defeat my opponent by not being an easy target for him. By understanding range, I come up with those ideas. The other drill we would do is we would have, we would sign everybody and be like, all right, everybody fight at A range, everybody fight at B range, everybody fight at C range, and try to have them maintain those ranges, and it's just basically the object is like any drill, you can't emulate real life completely with a drill. The drill is just to prepare you to work with the commonalities, so get them out there, go out, fight those range, or go and practice you and your best buddy. It's like, hey, you practice being at C range, I'll practice being at B range, and see how hard it is to maintain those a little bit. And also what it does, it gives you a spatial reference. Because when you have this spatial reference to your target and your training, you're like, oh, yeah, I notice when I'm at A range, I crouch. I never crouch at B range. And I definitely never crouch at C range, right? But I have a relationship with that range in my head, so I know where I'm at. So when you start going through probabilities in your head, when you're like focused on the fight, you don't have to think about things. Your battle computer has got the data for you for making decisions quicker. And your spatial awareness is very important. And I think pretty much in any, hand-to-hand, or one-on-one sport, whether it's martial, range and having that spatial awareness is a huge critical piece out there. We would go through those drills to understand that and learn those pieces to it. We got our little circles of range. And you notice in the back, I have those little different, this is a visual aid, because really when you think about it, when you're A range, you move closer to the center of the line. You're C, you only have the front targets. Let's talk about position and range. So we think about that position range. Here I basically just drew the V on an opponent. The V is basically, a lot of times, like I was talking earlier when we were talking about melee or tournament prep, a lot of things we do in melee relate to hardsuit fighting. It's just we just don't localize it enough. When you're fighting your opponent and you can get the flank on your opponent in melee, that's the one thing we're always trying to achieve. It's like, hey, cross the T, get 2-to-1 advantage on a corner. Well, when you're fighting one-on-one, it's hard to get a 2-to-1 advantage unless you got extra arms, right? But the fact of that your target is more vulnerable from the side than in the front is true. So when you're talking about that range and you're out there practicing and you're starting to do a little Pell work, or you're working with your friends and you're fighting and analyzing what you're doing, you got to take an account for the angle you are to your opponent. And this is where, position kind of blends in with range. Understanding range is the base point to developing your position skill set. And like we were talking earlier when we were talking about C range, it's really hard to sit there and go take a corner on your opponent because it's obvious when you're out there. So there we go. Up. So, when I'm moving on this line out here, he's like, hey, I'll turn with you because I can see you, right? But, you have to sit there and let's say he goes off in this direction and you actually do a lateral out on C and step and you have his flank open. I'm obviously a left-hander because I'm like going to this side to attack. Which those that know me, I'm left-handed, and that's kind of funny. But so your opponent, let's say your opponent moves off this direction, and you do a lateral step over here to get this flank, you ended up getting a lot more target. It's like the guy that charges you, right? And you're at C range, and you're still stepping over here, your target changes. When you're out on the Pell and you're working, you have to start thinking about these angles in relationship to your opponent. And you analyze that I'm still at C range because I took that lateral step. Because my target started moving closer to me, the shot I still threw was a C range shot. So you're still maintaining your position there and so forth. So keep that in mind a little bit when you're practicing. And then when you're analyzing a fight that you just had, like you did 3 passes with somebody and you want to kind of figure out what they're doing and so forth. That range didn't change because, he moves straight in on me. If he's moving straight in on me, yeah, we're both going to be at A range, right? But if he's coming in and I react on the outside C range, I'm still maintaining C range. I go to my Pell. let's say, I'm the lefty and I'm working on, I'm like, I really should get better at throwing flat snaps at guys when they come in at me, because for some reason they're coming in at me. I haven't figured out why I'm bait that way and they want to charge me down. Well, when I do this lateral step over here, well, when I'm practicing throwing my wrap, do I practice throwing a deep wrap in the middle of my sword, or do I practice on the tip of my sword? I practice on the tip of my sword, because that's the viable shot and the higher probability shot that I'm going to throw at this moment. So I found this common thing that's happening to me when I'm fighting. I go back to my Pell and I start practicing throwing tip shots, and what it takes for me to rotate my hand out from that position to throw the shot. But let's say he comes in and I'm actually stepping in and I'm coming in at B range. Then I'm going to practice throwing a deeper B range wrap shot on the Pell to meet that need. So this is how, this is really boils down to, it's a tool. It's a tool to analyze your fighting and to work with your training to build yourself up the skill sets you have. So you just don't have a putter, a driver, and a 7-iron. You still can play golf with those 3 clubs in your bag and make it through the course. But if you have a few additional clubs in your, you can do more jobs more accurate. Having a pitching wedge versus a 7-iron is a huge factor. And if you play golf, you get it. Use that perspective is what I'm really trying to get at, and start thinking. This is the analytical, and analytical has to happen in training so you improve your fighting. Does it change? Stuff changes all the time, and then there's some things that you find out about yourself, because like when we talked about tourney prep, you need to know what kind of fighter you are and who you are as a fighter. Where do you fight from? What is your strengths and weaknesses? This kind of tool helps define that for you and helps you prepare for the training needs that you need to provide for yourself, or even your students, the people you teach, because, hey, we're tribal. Our knowledge is not in books. Our knowledge is from, the lore we tell each other and the things we have based off the experience, and this, applying what I'm trying to teach here will give you a language to teach that to other people. And when we have a common language amongst ourselves, the impact of our training and teaching each other becomes even stronger, and it increases our skill set ability. We grow from here. We grow from a Commodore 64 to a gaming laptop we have now by having a baseline. We have a processor, a GPU, we've got RAM, and a storage device. So this is a little man here, and he's got his shield, and I drew a center line on this person, because, when I get into range, I start thinking about position a little bit, because it's a factor involved with it. And now you look at the line across here, because, I fight kind of square, but I do have a foot back. Some guys this guy's fighting sword leg forward, right? So this plane, this line that he's standing on is much different in relationship to his center line. He's not fighting square. When we look at our overview of somebody, that changes. This line of the shoulders here right now would be parallel to my opponent. So like in this drawing, right? They're parallel. But if he rotates a little bit, that line changes. That changes range a little bit, doesn't it? Because, like in this case, if this opponent was standing sword leg forward, this arm becomes more forward, right? It starts to creeps closer to this B range zone of the fight. Now, in the analytics of that, does that make that target closer to me? Closer doesn't mean that it's achievable to hit it, but it is closer to me. And it affects my fight in a lot of ways. So, when we think about it, this is a good base place to be. But this does add a little bit of more of a reality to our training and how we work out things. And it's a lot of food for thought right there to start thinking and milling over. And, and this is, really a good place to start discussing these things a little bit. and understanding the concept. How you apply the concept for yourself or your students is going to vary from person to person, because you're going to relate it to your own experiences. So just take this as a basics bucket. We just talked about 1 + 1 = 2. And then we get into position. Let's add 0 into our number line. And we're going to start doing a little more complicated math later, and we'll go into algebra, and figure out some what ifs, So, but anyhow, so keep that in mind. That position does change things a lot with that range a little bit, and it's that deception. And people, when if you fight enough, you start watching how people fight and you observe, you start figuring out a lot more of how they're disguising their range a little bit, and then how you bucket them, but that's a whole different class of assessing your opponent and probabilities, which becomes a whole different thing. But you got to get range down. You have to understand range and how you apply it training and your analytics. So I stress that over and over, and I know it sounds repeated, and I can beat a dead horse until all the blood's gone, but it is a very important factor here. I divided my opponent in half, and then I gave him 3 zones. You want to do 4 zones, you do 4 zones. Just be consistent. Make sure it sounds logical what you're doing. That's the key thing there. But, I'm looking at my range and my target availabilities and my zones. So, we're moving into position a little bit with this class. When we're talking that position, we got that, his position of his feet changes him a little bit, and then you have these zones, and I think these are pretty much the basic zones. Get the right and left of the guy. My relationship to his right and his left side are very important to me. I move this guy over to this side of the line more. Does my target zones change? Yeah, I'm farther away from this side of his body when I move over my body to this side, and vice versa. And like in Aidenveld, a good example is like Morgan and Ivan have something very similar to them. They rotate their body very deep to their left side in their position. Now, if you watch both of them and their feet and this center line of their body and how it adjusts to their opponent to achieve this part to get over here, is the thing you should watch. And they're a good example because they do a lot. You might find video on them, and it's a good little practice to think about position. When they get up in line with this individual, their center line will start center line to center line, but they got to adjust over here. They overcompensate to this side to achieve this side of their body. So they'll push over here, and then they take a step on this side of their body to get closer to their target. They're breaking this center line with theirs, but they're basically taking their center line and moving it to this side of the line. Like if this is a number line, this is going to the positive numbers. And when they get into the positive numbers, that means this hand right here that they're using can reach the other side of the body. And I think anybody that fights, they understand it's an off body that they're throwing. But they have to achieve that zone. And this is how this center line becomes a key factor in position. So when we go into this ABC, they're throwing an A-range shot. They're making that decision. You think about it. You watch them fight. They make that decision right here, this B place, decide that I'm going to throw the offside. And as I step through B, I'm going to push over here with my offense to scare my guy so he gives me a little more of his center line while I go over here and throw my shot. Because what I did is I got him to move his shield to that side of the number line. Given, talking about it is always freaking simple. Trying to manage it, it's a whole different ball of wax. But the key, understanding what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that center line is part of the how. The range is part of the how. Like I fight those guys on a regular basis. We have great fights with each other, and I have to sit there and I'm like, all right, being a lefty, you think about it, both our shields are on the same side. This is their bread and butter shot. I have to sit there and think, how do I return a response to them? You know, I can only duck so many times into a sombrero before they decide I'm just going to push them to the ground and start rapping the shit out of them. We figured this stuff out when we fight each other. It's not stupid. We're not stupid. We're trying to like best each other. So I have to return with multiple responses at different times to figure out, okay, I have to react to do that. I can come up with the greatest plan in the world, but if I don't know how he initiates it, I can't respond. So that's why it's an important factor when you're working with the range. And if more of us are on the same page when we're training, we can help each other a lot better. I can watch a video and tell a guy, yeah, you see where your feet are at C range? You see how you take that big step to B, and that's why you're out of balance? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'll take a look at that and see what I can do. How do I manage range? Well, let me talk about how I practiced and played with it in the lab. So I look at everything I do is practice is my lab time. So I go out there to go learn about stuff and commonalities. I would go to practice and I would sit there and I play at C range because I'm short and I fight with a 36-inch long sword. When I fight tall people that want to play range, it becomes a difficulty thing, and I have to come up with strategies to deal with those people. And at the time when I moved down to Touristic Theater, that was probably the one place where I ran into it the most because they had Duke Walrick here, and he loved doing. He was very good at fading back and throwing this shot we called the lasso, which was just a leg wrap, but it worked out great for him because he get a lot of force in it. He had good timing on it and everything else. So you're like, okay, well, this is his bread and butter. Is when you fight him enough, you figure out, okay, hey, the commonality is this is his bread and butter. His other stuff is all dependent on this, But I would play with range. What I would do is I would post up at my C range, and I would work over and I would move over on the outside circle of that range, So you remember how I had the circles around the opponent. So I would live out on this circle, and I would focus on going left and right on this circle and rotate him while we're out this range. Because after you figure out what's his engagement range, where do I have to be for my opponent to engage? Because when you think about it, this you fight people enough, you're going to see when their hand starts moving to throw a shot. When do they initiate their shot? That is a key thing I'm looking for. So I'll play out of C range and see where he throws and when he throws that shot. Now I go to B range and I look for that when he initiates his engagement. And it's like, all right, well, I felt confident that when I was traversing C to B, I would find out that's when he would initiate a shot. This is his comfort zone because I met the range requirement he had to throw his shot. Even though he's walking backwards, he's dependent on me forcing movement forward, but I have to still be at a range because he knows I have to be so far away from him for that shot to come in contact sufficiently. He's practiced enough to figure that out in his battle computer. So once I'm into that particular range distance, he knows to initiate and throw that shot, right? So how do I negate that? Because that's what you're really looking for. How do I close? What do I do to negotiate range with my opponent, right? Well, understanding how my opponent has to do something is how I start the process, because I need to know what causes that action to happen. What are they reacting to do the opposite of what they want. To negotiate any situation there, I have to do the opposite. So I have to deny him that range. I have to deny him the opportunity to engage me. Well, how do you kill a guy by disengaging the fighter? Do I go out to sea? Do I run away? No, but I stop chasing him. Because you think about it, like in his case, in the C range, I need to stop chasing the guy. Now let's say he's in A range, Duke Morgan, King Cave Troll, His Majesty, Royal Majesty Morgan, to be proper. Sorry. He's an A range fighter. He's looking for that. And how do I navigate the range? Well, navigating the range, since he's more of an A range fighter, closing is what he wants, right? So what does that really boil down when you think about it? This is a good time to think about this. He's an A range fighter. I'm an A range fighter. So we both want to be in the same place together, but I have to battle this guy. And if I was a C range fighter, how would I battle him? Well, I stay away from him. He can't engage because he wants to be A range. but you know, I want to. My position, your position becomes, the closer you become to somebody, your position becomes more critical. Remember how like a B range, that's when you make a decision on what range you go to or position you want to go to your opponent. C's the setup for B. You know, you these are where the range factors come involved. It's like, where's the center line of my opponent? Where are the target zones available to me? When I move to this position, what do I do? How do I navigate and make a decision between them becomes the question that's next, right? We're navigating this range and position at the same time. Well, I look at it and I try to teach it as it's windows. You have a window of opportunity, and then, the more experienced fighters figure out when so-and-so does this and they're in this position, I have time to go to this next place. And like when we all fight, the guys that practice all the same time, our buddies, we get good at fighting our buddies all the time because we fight every week, because our brain is processing this information in canalized and throwing it in its database, right? Then we go out to the general populace. It's like, I always love going to Pennsic. That's one of my favorite events. We go to Pennsic and we got this guy that's really good at home. Then he goes to Pennsic and everybody serves him up. And he's like, what the F happened to me? I thought I was a good fighter, to come home disheartened. Like, no, dude, you just got used to fighting everybody else. And the way you're thinking is what's screwing you up. You're actually a good fighter. You're just not applying your skill set. You're just applying it by fighting Joe and John and Gary, who you fight every week, because you're dependent on them doing certain things and you react to them. But so we're trying to get in this position. So you're in your position and you're dependent on figuring out what they're doing and how they're doing things. Those are where those factors come into play, because you have the center line, you have your target zones, you have your ranges. These are variables in your math equation. We just started to do a little algebra right now. Our definitive is us in relationship to our target. Does this part of the puzzle kind of make sense? Because it's going to vary for every one of us, and our fighting styles and our strengths. I'm left-handed. It's going to be different than somebody that's 5'9" and fights a 36-inch sword with a round shield that's right-handed. It's going to vary differently. Duke William, he's a taller guy. He's a very analytical fighter. And when you fight him, his tempo is different than mine. He's more, in a sense, stoic in his body language. So he's just standing there. He's calculating, waiting for you to do something. To where I'm like, I'm going to move to the left. I'm going to move to the right. But I'm very intentional when I move, and then it changes the things a little bit too. And, but our different body languages are a factor involved in gaining position. I'm at C range, and one of the things I love to do at C range to try to poke and prod at my opponent is I float into C and back out. I just go in and out. So I'm basically like, if you saw me on an overhead view, I'm drawing a circle and I'm just going, looping and looping. Because when you have spatial awareness, you feel when you're in range, and your opponent feels he's in range too. And when you sit there and you go, I'm in it, I'm out of it. I'm in it, I'm out of it. Think about that feedback he's getting. It sounds funny, but it's true. He's like, oh, I'm going to fire. Oh, wait, no, he's out. Oh, wait, I can fire. No, he's out. What is he doing? You start thinking, right? His train of thought is changing. And what I'm trying to do is get him to start changing and get uneasy. I need him to not feel comfortable, because how many times have you been in a melee? You stand there with your weapon of choice, like I fight 9-foot spear. I can be on a bridge and I'm sitting there, I'm like, this bridge is going down. You get in a groove and you're like, I'm here. But as soon as that one guy comes up, and like Pennsic, it's always some guy with the crappiest set of loaner gear or whatever. And he's tall, skinny, and wiry. And he shows up and on the line, and he's like bobbing and weaving and doing everything else. And the next thing you know, I'm like, oh yeah, we'll get that guy. Next thing you know, he starts nuking the bridge. you know. And as soon as he gets one guy, my flow stopped, right? You know, your flow stops where that one guy came out and you're like, great, that's the guy, him on the line over there is the one that ruined it for the rest of us. I was going to kill this whole bridge. That's the guy ruining it. But that's the thing is he came along and he changed the pace of that battle and ruined the thought process that's going on. So now we apply this to individual combat. You know, me going in and out of that range, playing with it, especially with the C range guy, he keys off. He wants to be at his C range to throw shots. I'm going in it, and then I'm leaving it. I'm going in it, and I'm leaving it. And I'm rotating. I'm getting him to move. Because you think about it, long range guys, what is their commonality? This is the buckets thing that I like to talk about. You know, put fighters in buckets. Craven's a short A-range fighter that's left-handed. So I got 3 little buckets on him. I got this tall guy that fights a C range, you know, but he doesn't move very much, or he moves a lot. But the one thing I know is he moves backwards a lot because there's C range fighters that don't, you know, but he moves backwards a lot. So I got this backwards fighter. He's in this bucket. So I need to go, well, what database? Long range fighter, he backups a lot. What can I do? You know, what are common features to that? Oh, he has to back up to throw. All right. Well, I need to get him to back up so he throws, but I don't want to get hit by that throwing. So what do I got to do to get him to back up? Because what am I looking for? Remember earlier? Windows of opportunity. Him backing up and throwing a shot is an opportunity for me to do something. You know, what that something is depends on what he does and how he does it, right? But it's like, oh, yeah, get him to go backwards. You know, so I got to get him to engage. So I got to put some pressure on him and get him to move, get him to throw. And I know I need to know where he keys. So he starts throwing a shot. He gets in the middle of a shot. What's my opportunity? Throw it at his freaking arm. It's the closest thing into my B range, my C range, because he's taller than me and he's throwing away. So I hunt for his arm. Why do I need to focus on that helmet? What do I have against helmets anyways? I should hate arms more. That's what holds swords. Helmets protect heads. I shouldn't hit heads. That's how brain damage happens. So the best thing I do for my opponent is hit him in the arm. I just helped him. I was kind. But anyhow, you know, but it does get you to think a little bit. You know, it's like, hey, you're trying to negotiate these things and you're looking for opportunities. Go watch those two people fight. See what happens when they initiate a shot. What position were they in? What was their relationship and their range to their opponent before they threw that shot? What did they do with their body? You know, the key thing is, what did they do with their hand before they threw that shot, right? And if you sat there and you watched them do a set of 5 fights, even the same guy, and you're like, you know, he threw that shot and he initiated his hand this way each time. I'm going to go fight him and see what I can do to get him to do that same thing for me. It's like, what range do I have to be at for him to initiate that? You know, I call that the key. It's like a database reference. It's the key to the database. These parameters need to be met for him to do this activity. When I understand that, I understand what to do to mitigate that, because I can do the opposite. I can prevent that from happening, or I can control when that happens. Because if he throws a shot and I can get him to throw a shot at me when I want it, means I'm in control of the dance. I get him to throw the shot that I know that he's going to throw, like the off body. That means I know where to throw my shot because I know what positions he's in, what targets are open. I'm trying to use the math to work for me. So I set up, give him the shot he wants. I block the shot, and I throw to the target zone that's open because I know it's open. My mind is ahead of it rather than reacting. You know, is it definite? It is never a definite, but I'm working in the probabilities, and I'm looking for what is my most successful shot and location to throw that shot at. You know, and the only way you learn that is by observing. And the thing is because I watch Morgan do it, you know, like I love watching the guys I fight on a normal basis, you know, because they're the people that are. But, you know, they're consistent, and I'm looking and watching for those consistencies. But let's say I go to Pennsic and I start fighting a guy, right? Well, because I practice across an individual, a human being that has the best computer processor in the world going on in their head, and they're changing and moving. Well, the thing is, I'm training my eye to observe and look for those keys. The faster I get at looking those keys means the faster I can adjust to fighting that individual. You know, I go do a pass with a guy at Penzic. We go do 2 fights, and I start thinking, and I'm looking for what his keys are, where his feet and his position are, and how he negotiates that determines how fight number 3, 4, 5, and 6 go. Because once I figure out his key, he initiates contact at this range, in this position, I know how to manage that. You know, and when you practice that tool, instead of figuring out how does Craven fight, you know, how does Morgan fight, you start going, what's Craven's trigger? That's what I have to beat. But that's the challenge you got to go do to practice, is observe people and then go try to replicate it with them. You know, and the game to play, and this was my favorite game I did, like, I guess it was about 8 years ago. I tried to spend half a year doing the opposite of whatever I thought. So I'm going to fight, and it's like, throw the offside, you know, over your head, right? That's one of my things, right? I'm like, throw the flat snap. And I would throw it. I did these opposites. And, you know, the reason I did these opposites is to break myself from being a pattern. And because the thing is, I just told you to watch somebody and figure the commonalities. We're human. We're going to do them. We're all conditioned. If you think about your daily life, when you would drive to work every day, how many days did you do the same thing over and over in the process of going out that door? You know, we're habitual. You don't want to get ambushed by the enemy. You do not take the same path every time.